I'm Franca Palazzo, Executive Director of the Canadian Internet Society, and I want to thank you all for braving the storm to come to be here today. Before we get going, I want to give a big thank you to TELUS, who is sponsoring today's event. A special thank you to Bill Abbott, who advocated for sponsorship and helped me organize today. Thank you to our speakers, Erin Kelly, CEO and co-founder of Advanced Symbolics, Jaxson Khan, Senior Fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, Michael Geist, Professor, University of Ottawa, Faculty of Law, Common Law Section, also Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law, and most recently, a board director of the Canadian Internet Society. And finally, Brent Arnold, chair of the Canadian Internet Society, partner at INQ Law, and Brent will be moderating today's discussion. A quick word for those of you who are new to our work. We advocate for an internet that is open, safe, accessible, and resilient enough to support Canada's long-term digital future. A big part of our role is making sure that policymakers understand that well-meaning policy proposals can have real unintended impacts on the internet and the Canadians who rely on it. Today's conversation is about Canada's national AI strategy, which is expected soon, and the What We Heard release from the consultation. We're here to look at what it highlighted, what was underplayed, and what practical recommendations should be on the table before the strategy is finalized. We'll cover the big themes that kept coming up: IP and commercialization, digital sovereignty and foreign dominance, accountability and regulation, sustainability and energy demand, and job impacts. And we'll bring trust back to the center, because trust and public confidence are the requirements for adoption. If people don't trust how AI is being used or who is accountable when it fails, the strategy will not gain traction and it won't hold up over time. Now I'd like to introduce Katie Preiss. Katie is the Vice President of Public Policy and Government Relations at TELUS. Katie? Thank you again.
Thanks, Franca. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We acknowledge that our work and the topics that we discuss today impact many Indigenous territories and treaty areas, and we recognize the land as an act of recognition and gratitude. For those of us joining remotely, I also want to acknowledge the Indigenous territories and lands on which you are living and working. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. There's no shortage of debate on AI and AI policy, and I know we're all very eager to hear from our panelists today, so I'll be brief. Unprecedented is a word that I hear thrown around a lot. In the past decade, we've faced unprecedented health, economic, geopolitical, technological, and environmental changes. But there's one through line, at least for me, that's given me hope. I've always believed that Canada has the best resources, both natural and human, to face these challenges. AI is what we're here to talk about today, and what an incredible opportunity Canada has with AI. One of the biggest criticisms about AI is how resource intensive it is, both in terms of power to run the factories and water to cool them. Canada has all of the ingredients. We hold all the cards. Finally, a reason to rejoice about the inclement weather, to say nothing of our electrical grids that are powered by renewable energy. TELUS has leaned in hard. We put our money where our mouth is, and we converted our existing data center in Rimouski into an AI factory that's now Canada's fastest supercomputer. And we did it by deploying a closed-loop water cooling system that relies for most of the year on the very cold weather we have outside today. to keep our computers running smoothly, and the factory is also powered by 99% renewable energy, making it one of the most environmentally friendly data centers in the world. Building more capacity is the first challenge, but it's a pretty straightforward one. New Canadian data centers leveraging our unique geography and our resources will help Canada lead in AI. The second challenge is much more nuanced, and it's what we're here to talk about today. How do we deploy and commercialize AI for the benefit of Canadians? And how do we do so in such a way that prioritizes our national security? Sitting at the heart of these questions is the idea of sovereignty, protecting ourselves so that Canadians can benefit. Sovereignty, not solitude, Minister Solomon said, and that's a catchy narrative, and I like it. But it assumes we all agree on what sovereignty means, and I'm not sure that we do, not yet. So let me assert a definition for you. At TELUS, sovereignty for AI starts at the infrastructure layer, creating a safe bedrock for all Canadian ecosystems to build on. For our most sensitive data, full control by a company that's operated end-to-end in Canada is critical to protect against foreign interference. The next step, one I'm hoping to get soon from this government, is a policy framework that provides a functional definition of AI so that businesses and governments have the confidence to build, invest, and scale here in Canada. A definition that is used consistently across government departments and is adopted by provinces to boot. I mentioned from the outset that Canada has the resources we need to succeed, and some of those resources are the smart people on this panel today. So I'm looking forward to hearing their thoughts. And with that, let me turn things over to our next speaker, the chair of the Canadian Internet Society and the moderator of our panel, Brent Arnold.
Thanks very much, Katie, and thank you, Franca. A few sort of housekeeping notes. Panel, please come on up. I apologize for the sound of my voice. I had the dreaded man flu 2 weeks ago. I've almost recovered my voice. Second, we are going to go through till about 9:45, at which time we're going to switch to the Q&A, at which time, because unfortunately I'm a working barrister, I'm going to abandon the panel and leave them to your mercy, because I have to run down the hall to join a virtual hearing. That's life in the service industry. So I had planned to briefly introduce our panelists a bit more, but judging from the fact that there's a full room on a day where we may end up all staying over here, thanks to the weather, I'm guessing you already know who these folks are. So I'm just going to take a really brief moment to sketch how we all ended up here, and then we're just going to get right into it. Thank you. Those of you who have been watching this space, which I'm guessing is all of you, will recall that we didn't have a federal artificial intelligence law. Then we had a draft law appear from nowhere. And then we had a consultation process on that law. And then we had an election and that law went away. Then we had a brief 30-day sprint consultation process in which over 10,000 submissions were received by the federal government, including one from the Canadian Internet Society, which I understand was read by a chatbot. And now we are working towards a new law, new policy, presumably. And I've been a bit flip up to this point, but I think that we may be having a different discussion than we thought we were going to have a couple of months ago, when we were still talking about, have we overcorrected in favor of regulation? Do we need to focus more on innovation? Obviously, the events of the last few weeks with the shooting at Tumbler Ridge have a lot of people thinking now we do need to be thinking about regulation, and we need to be thinking about it seriously and now. All that said, we are going to talk about the process for getting to where we need to go. We're going to talk about the substance of what laws in this area ought to look like. So, with that said, I'm going to start with Michael. And Michael, you've commented a lot on the process that got us to this point. So I wanted to ask you, you'd said the current strategy is largely performative, and you raised concerns about the AI-driven analysis that I just mentioned with the 10,000 consultation responses and how those were handled. What are the biggest flaws in how the government's handled this process so far?
Okay. Could go for a while, I think, with that question. I guess I'll start by saying I think the reference to performative actually was in the context of what we saw most recently with OpenAI. But
Fair.
And I'm looking forward to get into that. Although, honestly, I think it probably could apply equally with respect to this consultation. And I guess I would highlight at least a couple of things, and then we can drill down a bit more. I think one element, and you mentioned it, a 30-day sprint isn't a real consultation. 30-day sprint may allow certain groups, Internet Society and others that have resources to try to contribute something, but the notion that you can get, I think, into a real analysis and real effort to try to take the temperature of what people think and where their concerns lie, it's very tough to do in 30 days. It feels that doing this in the way that it was done, including with the expert advisory group that they pulled together and then had to make slight changes to, was all done rapidly to be able to tick a box to say, we went and we consulted, and we did it at internet speed sort of thing, or AI speed. But I don't know that results in necessarily the best policy. Jaxson and I did a podcast together, and he said, well, we could go 60 or 90 days. I'm not sure it would change all that much. I actually think it might have changed some of the outputs, but even more, I think it would change the signaling that it has to say that this is actually something serious as opposed to something that you're doing that's a bit more performative. But the real performative side comes, I think, from that, what is described as a what we heard report. It feels more like either a what we wanted to hear report or what we want you to think we heard report. Because when you take a look at the data that they received, both in terms of the 10,000 responses they got on the survey, as well as from the analysis reports that they got from the various experts. And to their credit, all of that information is openly available. So you can put it into a chatbot too, and I did. And so you can get analysis from Claude or ChatGPT or whatever that will do the same kind of analysis that the government did. And I think what you will find, or at least what I found, is that the points of emphasis that we get from the government are not the same as, generally speaking, what they heard. And frankly, we saw that right off the top. Franca gave an introduction that talked about the issues that we're going to focus on. Newsflash, those were not, for the most part, the focal points of what people actually wanted to talk about, or at least what they did talk about. And so while the emphasis continues to be on issues like sovereignty, for example, or people's fear or AI hype, when you look what actually people did talk about, they talked about capital and the lack of capital. They talked about the need for speed in addressing some of these issues. There was many different points of emphasis in terms of the responses that the government got as opposed to what it actually says they got in that what we heard report, which leads me to believe that at the end of the day, this is somewhat performative. It certainly leaves the option to move in any number of different directions. But if you're skewing a little bit what you heard to meet an agenda that you might have had, a policy agenda that you might have had, that to me is in many ways the very definition of what a performative consultation happens to be. Please.
Yeah, I think my heart really sank when I attended one of the sessions with, it was somebody that was advising the minister, a volunteer, but somebody from his volunteer cabal. And he was standing up saying, we've got to figure out as a government where we're going to put the money. And I put up my hand and I said, okay, listen, the government only has so much money. That's not a good strategy. What is your strategy for getting investors to put their money? I don't want a check from Evan Solomon. I want a check from an investor.
I'll take a check from Evan Solomon.
Yeah, especially the 100 million that he gave Bengio. And the person said, actually, that's out of scope for what we're doing. I was like, that's out of scope? Investors in AI? Like, you can't fund this just as the government. People will go crazy. And he said, but I'll certainly take that back. I was just like, I can't even believe that's not part of the strategy. We can't talk about AI sovereignty and owning AI and being everything if we have no money. So that was a turning point for me.
Yeah, unless we're talking about nationalizing an industry that's worth more than the entirety of the country, I think you're probably right on that. Jaxson, on a related note, I'm going to put you on the hot seat as our government guy. You've described the strategy as unknown at this point, and you noted, and we talked a bit about this already, that 30-day consultation window and the limited transparency around it. From your time inside government, explain everyone for us, explain yourselves. How do you explain these kinds of choices? And I'm not asking you to excuse them, but how did we get here?
Yep, no, and great to be here with everyone. Nothing starts off a morning on a dark day like talking about internet policy, so thanks for making it happen. Quick correction to something Erin said. We were not volunteers as a former policy advisory minister. We were just poorly paid given the amount of hours that we put in, so just want to level set here. I'm also really grateful to be on stage with Michael. I frequently came to Michael for advice and coffee chats during my time in government. It's because he's often, if you may allow me to say, annoyingly right about a lot of things. But I will just quickly say that Michael and I had a good podcast recently. We did talk about things like could it have been longer? longer at this consultation? Could it have been shorter? Certainly. I think 30 days is pretty darn fast. At the same time, I've heard something from a number of stakeholders, both critical of the government, I would say by default, and maybe more positive of the government, is everybody wants something done fast, even though they're also asking for more time to input. So there is this like natural challenge, and especially given the moment that Canada's in right now, everything does feel quite urgent. We're seeing a lot of job layoffs, seeing a lot of concern, and gosh, AI more than anything seems to be driving so much anxiety. So I will start with maybe a note of empathy. I do empathize with public servants in particular who have to handle these types of decisions. I think it's hard. How did this process come about? Brent, you did one of the best summaries I've ever heard. I think I'm going to give some custom instructions to my ChatGPT, or rather now Claude, because I've totally switched over, to say that I want Brent movie reviews all the time, because that was just so quick and fast. I think, like, how do we get to this point? The government has tried a whole bunch of different things. Some of it succeeded on AI. I would say, if I may, that the Sovereign AI program seems to be more received positively by a number of different stakeholders. On the AI bill, there was a lot of concern and controversy from both sides. Oh, industry was saying this is too much, too fast, not clear enough. Civil society wanted far more, maybe something more like the EU. And so the government's trying to do a bit of a clean slate here. But at the same time, again, there's this challenge where the minister's trying to change his signaling, saying we're going to do lighter regulation, and then also a lot of industry. But then something like Tumblr Rinch happens and they reassemble the online harms panel. They try and quickly say, okay, we're going to approach it through this legislative vehicle. And this. So anyways, that's just a quick summary from things I'm seeing. Let's talk about process for a second. Again, it could have been longer. I think one of the biggest issues that I see from a summary and transparency perspective is, and this is why it's important to delve into individual reports. This summer report, what are we going to typically see from a report like this? You're not going to get the strategy itself. You're not going to get, we heard this and here's exactly what we're going to do. You're going to hear a bit of a weird synthesis of a whole bunch of different things, because if you look at the 32 different reports, they're often saying very different stuff. Some people are saying, let's go and start a bunch of moonshots. And other people are saying, let's go and invest in strategic sectors. Other people are saying, let's pick national champions. Some of those should be defense champions. Other people are saying, yeah, we need to amend multiple pieces of legislation to tackle public trust. Other people are saying, actually, we have to tackle negative public sentiment, but let's do more safety reporting, transparency of inputs, outputs, things like that. So these are very, very different prescriptions. So again, I empathize a little bit. It is hard to summarize this perfectly. And what I would just say is the strategy is unknown because we don't have it. And so I would say that I would wait a little bit longer. We'll see if the government meets its timeline of end of quarter. My prediction is might be a little bit of delay based on, again, the events of Tumblr Ridge and also other pieces of forthcoming legislation. We'll see. But I think the proof will be in the pudding of what choices have they actually made. And those choices are emphasized more in the individual reports than the summary report.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say probably none of us envies the folks that have to come up with policy to govern what seems to be the most transformative technology we've had in this country since the internet or the railway. But as Canadians, we reserve our right to complain about what they decide regardless. Erin, last question on this on the policy part of this. You've said that we can't just copy American approaches to and relying on large language models, and that those aren't necessarily the future of AI in Canada. Your own Canadian-developed AI still relies on a foreign cloud, like just about every company in the country, I would think, because local providers can't match what you need at this point. How does that reality change the way Ottawa talks about digital sovereignty in the near term? We heard a helpful definition from our speaker from TELUS, and there are a lot of other definitions floating around, obviously.
Yeah, and I think, so thank you. I have given my architecture to every sovereign cloud provider in Canada, and none of them can host my app. Okay, now, I have a very complex AI technology. It's going to need a lot more than a computer holding my data. It needs message queuing. It needs to be able to host Kubernetes. And all of these are not Canadian technologies. So it's not just hosting data. You have to be able to serve it up. It needs to be able to scale. So there's all sorts of things. It has very strict security requirements and all of these things that are all done. And I have, like I said, I've given it to, I won't name names, but I've given it to them and they say, oh, we can't do this. So this is very much to me, like I don't know anything about making cars, but when the people from the automakers union or whatever tells me you can't just decouple this, I feel for them immediately, because we cannot just, maybe I'm going to talk to Katie after this, can I just put it on a TELUS server? If I can, great, but so far I have not been able to do that. So we can't just say, okay, come May, you need to be, and I have been told that, by the way, with the government, because I have government contracts, and oh, we're not doing your foreign cloud, American cloud service anymore, you have to go over here, but I can't go over there. And I'm a fully Canadian company. Are you going to throw out the Canadian AI innovator because she has to be on a cloud because we can't host it here? It's frustrating.
No, absolutely. As someone that practices, this isn't about me, but I practice in the cybersecurity realm. And for my clients, data residency isn't really good enough. We're worried about the Patriot Act. We're worried about the Cloud Act. So, yeah, I'm obviously very sympathetic.
And I have American customers too, to your point.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. I lied when I said it was the last procedural question on this, but we've gotten into this area now of defining digital sovereignty, and not an easy concept to get our arms around. But Jaxson, I want to take this back to you. The definitions we've seen now are ranging from, and again, we had an excellent definition from TELUS, but we're also seeing ones from Canadian-owned infrastructure to simply having Canadians on staff, to things that look like just data residency, but will encrypt your data, which works fine until quantum computing comes along. What does a meaningful definition look like to you that could guide investment and regulation?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I will say I think there's two different ways we can approach this problem. One is we're looking for a dictionary definition of how do we get this perfect sovereignty definition that encompasses everything in the modern era of digital realm. And the other definition is a policy definition, which is actually useful. And so I have to say, if we were to make a choice, a lot of people are talking about infrastructure. I actually do think that is generally the right angle because, again, if we're trying to do something, let's say with our digital resources, or we're trying to protect them, we cannot do that if we don't own the bridge. Otherwise, we're using the other guy's bridge. We have to pay rent every time. That may be happening right now in Canada and in Windsor. Or if we have these great resources, we don't have a pipeline and we don't control it, we can't get it anywhere. And so do we set the rules? That is very important. But if we don't even own the infrastructure, own the railways of this world, it doesn't matter. Are we going to be able to own all the railways as a country? Absolutely not. It's just a farcical concept. We do not have enough capital at this current point in near medium term to do all this. Erin, as you rightly pointed out, do we even have the technological sophistication to do this for highly innovative workloads? Probably not in the short term, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to, over time, reduce dependency. Just as we have a massive trade dependency in the United States, which probably could have been avoidable, are we going to get rid of that anytime soon? No. Can we reduce it over time? And probably should we for the sake of our economy, society? Absolutely. And so I think for a useful definition, I will do a shameless self-plug here, but we did release a new paper from University of Toronto yesterday called Sovereign by Design, Strategic Options for Canadian AI Sovereignty. I think that this goes into more depth of how we can treat these investment type decisions while also having lots of respect for the considerations that do make up our society and do make up a lot of the concerns that we do have as Canadians about, okay, where is the digital world going? But I think primarily these sovereignty decisions right now are investment ones. And I think regulatory ones are still important, but maybe somewhat secondary to, hey, can we even control this? Because if we don't control this, we are subject to someone else's rules because we are dependent on them.
And if I could just add, because you're right, it is an investment thing. Do you know when we put out telephony across this large country, we did it at a loss. And that's why Bell had a monopoly originally and why they do, because it wasn't cost effective. For the things that I'm doing, for example, the money is in the infrastructure. The money is in storing the data. The money is not in doing all the scaling and all of that you have to do for my stuff. So it is going to require, I don't blame the Canadian hosters that I've talked to because most of their customers, I think, are just hosting web pages. They're not doing a deep cognitive AI. So are they going to build out all this infrastructure for Erin? Probably not. But there's going to be more AIs like mine. That is the future. The future is not in sort of basic stuff. But there's going to be a loss as we're building it out. So that needs to be compensated. I don't think business is going to take the loss.
I just wanted to jump in. The problem, I think, with saying it's primarily an infrastructure issue, and you didn't say that, is that it's the place where we ought to start, is that we live in a world where we might own, even if we own the bridge, somebody else establishes the rules about who can cross or other related information associated with that bridge. And so long as, and Brent made reference to Cloud Act or Patriot Act, or frankly, it could be any number of different rules where we might see the assertion of someone else's laws on data or on operations that occur here by entities so long as they have some sort of connection to that other jurisdiction. Those other jurisdiction laws may well apply, or at least there'll be a willingness to apply those laws. And so we can't just say, if we build it, we've addressed the issue. We have to, at the same time, explore how do we ensure that we've got rules in place that achieve whatever it is we want to achieve from a sovereign perspective. So if that is Canadian privacy rules, Trump, so to speak, in where there is a conflict of laws, then we need to find mechanisms to try to do that. Now, at the moment, our privacy laws are so weak. It's not clear to me why we are so insistent that we want to ensure the Canadian privacy laws apply. They're not all that good to begin with. But if that's your starting point, that you want to ensure that Canada's laws will apply to data held in Canada by Canadian entities, the infrastructure piece is only part of the puzzle, or piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely. And it's probably worth a fast follow to your point. Somebody asked me right before we started this whether my spies had any idea when we were going to be seeing a new federal privacy law along the way, and candidly, the answer is no. Those of us that sort of work in the sphere sort of treat this as all of one piece: AI, cyber, privacy, all of it together. And it all needs to function as a whole, really, or it's not going to work. And that law seems to be left by the wayside. So I'd be curious to see what happens with that. It's probably also worth pausing at this point to thank and recognize the work of the federal government with the Gordie Howe Bridge in creating the world's largest freestanding metaphor. So I'd like to shift gears a little bit here. Let's talk about regulation and protection, and possibly performative protection. Performative may be the other key theme that's arising here today. Erin, you've been critical about the government's recent response to OpenAI. We talked a bit about this before, and whether steps like expert consultation would have changed anything in cases like the AI-linked harm, like we've seen so far. From an operator's perspective, what does an actually effective response to AI misuse look like?
Yeah, thanks. So I actually brought this up about 6 months ago on Steve Pakin's show, and we were talking about mis and disinformation. And I was very emphatic then. The government is putting onto business what should be its job, okay? If I go online and I say vaccines kill people, have I broken the law? What is Facebook going to do? It's not illegal for me to say I think vaccines kill people. If they take my post off, they're violating my charter right to free speech. So if the government wants this taken off, they need to create laws that say you're not allowed to go online and say that. Okay? So let's look at Tumbler Ridge for a moment. The mother of the shooter called the authorities several times. We know that. If you don't believe mom when she says, I think you need to take my child into custody, why are you going to believe some bureaucrat from OpenAI in San Francisco who thinks this person is it? This is a failure of our system. And even if somebody goes online and says, I want to know how to use a gun, I want to know how to shoot people, is that against the law? Why did the authorities not do anything when mom called? Because no laws were broken. The police they can't just arrest people because you think they're weird. Okay, there has to be a law broken. So this is the government's job to create laws. We'll apply the law. If you tell me that people can't be researching certain things on my AI, then we will look for that and we'll shut it down. But so far, I've not heard anything there. When it comes to, like, we've heard a lot about the child pornography stuff with the image creators. Is it against the law? Like, we're not sure. If I take a pencil and I draw kiddie porn for myself, am I breaking the law? No, because I don't think so. So is it different when you get your AI to do it? If no child has been harmed, because that's what I'm not a lawyer, you're the lawyer. We just need to
I'm watching Michael's face, actually, because he's the law professor.
So, like, I think companies are doing things like shutting down accounts and stuff like that. But even then, it's not really clear when you shut it down, when you don't, because I don't think it's clear. And I think instead of blaming OpenAI and saying you should have called, you know what we always hear? Privacy, privacy. We've mentioned it here. As a company, I get my privacy stuff reviewed every year by a lawyer. We've got our privacy protocols, our privacy. But now you're telling me if somebody says something and I'm not sure what, I should drop the privacy and call the government and tell them this person is doing this. So it's not clear, I think, as a business, what the rules are. And I think that's the government's job to tell us what the rules are, not for us to make them up and guess.
It doesn't help that often when companies or government are asked hard questions, they say, sorry, privacy. And that is a pretty short way of ending the discussion. Gentlemen, you were both looking at me while we were having that discussion. Who wants to go first?
So I'll jump in quickly. I hope we do have time to talk about the tragedy at Tumbler Ridge and the government's response to what OpenAI did or didn't do. But I did want to respond to this notion that government needs to get in and decide what's permissible and what's not from a speech perspective. I actually don't think that's the case. You have a right under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to speak, but you don't have a right to speak necessarily on someone's platform. And so platforms do get to make decisions about what they will host and what they won't host. And I don't think the solution lies in having the government tell the platforms with certain kinds of exceptions. Child pornography simply isn't permitted. Terror content isn't permitted. There's certain kinds of speech that is unlawful. And so the expectation is that the platforms would address that. The problem is in the awful but lawful speech, the speech that does create harms but is lawful. You have a right to say it, but the platform doesn't have an obligation to host it. Where I think the platform ought to have an obligation is to uphold the very policies that it establishes. So if you've got a platform that establishes policies that says certain kinds of content we are not going to permit, it goes beyond our community standards, you can say it, but just not here. I think part of the problem that we have is that many of the platforms are at best inconsistent in how they apply those policies. And frankly, oftentimes they don't apply them very effectively at all. If we had moved forward with, and I did not have Defending the Online Harms Act on my bingo card today, but had we moved forward with Bill C-63, the piece dealing specifically with platforms, which envisioned a principle of a duty to act responsibly, and acting responsibly, I think, might well be interpreted to include that you abide by and enforce the very policies that you yourself establish, I think we would at least be in a position to address some of that awful but lawful speech. And so it isn't that we would be telling platforms, this is the speech you must remove, although we might well do that for certain kinds of speech, but rather you make some of these policies. It might be to your benefit to say that there's certain kinds of conduct or speech we don't want on our platform. Our advertisers don't like it, our users don't like it, and so we don't want it there. But once you establish that policy, you've got an obligation to ensure that it's effectively enforced.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in here because my AI, among other things, we do research on social media. So we do public opinion research. We track foodborne illness in Canada. So we do a lot of deep research as well. When we first developed it, we had to figure out what the voice was going to be of Polly because the internet's kind of raunchy. I think we can all agree. There's a lot of F-bombs.
Can you step back for a second? Would you like to take just a couple minutes and tell us exactly what because it's fascinating. Tell us what Polly does before we go on to your point.
Sure. Polly can forecast future behaviors based on social media conversations that she is analyzing today. So that's why we're able to predict the spread of foodborne illness in Canada like we can tell you in 4 weeks it's going to go this way. Like the salmonella outbreak, Polly was able to say that this was salmonella. It came from the cantaloupes, so PHAC could get the cantaloupes off the shelves. But we also we predict elections, we predict all sorts of things, buying behavior and things like that. And Polly will, because our customers, some of them, not all of them can read graphs and things like that, so she'll summarize the reports for people. And originally, when we first developed it, I went down to U of T as my alma mater, actually at the Munk school, and I had a bunch of people there, and I said, here's our new AI, and this was before OpenAI, okay? And here she is summarizing the conversations, and it was pretty raunchy, and people in the front were like, that's terrible, you got to clean that up, because it was very raw, and I'm like, but this is authentic. We don't want authentic, this is terrible. Okay, fine. So we trained her on the New York Times and the Globe and Mail, but then she had no opinion. She was like, on the one hand, this.
It does sound like the New York Times, yeah.
No, she was on the one hand this, on the other hand that, and she was very politically correct. It was just boring. It's public opinion research. We need an opinion at the end of this paragraph. So then we had to clean up her talk, but then she cleaned up so much. My point is, it took us about, honestly, 2.5 years to train her on how to have a good voice. Because the problem with an AI, it's not like regular programming. It's not like I can just say, don't ever say F this or don't ever say these things. I can say that, but it's like a child. If you overcorrect, become anxious, okay? Like the AI became anxious. That's the best way to describe it. It was like, now it didn't say anything about sex ever, even when you're talking about LGBTQ and all that, treated that's off topic, and then we couldn't do any kind of research. So that is part of the problem. I do have empathy for Facebook when they're trying to monitor their own network. Everybody thinks it's just a matter of taking this out, taking that out, but there is like a spectrum of what you can have, and if you go too far, you take out too many things. Do you know what I mean? It is very difficult to do. So it's not a trivial problem, is what I would say.
I commend you for not starting by trying to train it on Twitter. We've seen how well that goes. Go ahead, Jaxson.
I want to go back to the reports for a second. This is from one of them, which says, we must aggressively tackle the negative public sentiment on AI. If we do not overcome this, we will face a backlash, and many of the investments will be lost, as well as the path to a prosperous future. That's Joelle Pineau, who's the chief AI officer at Cohere, used to be AI lead at Meta. She also talks about technical solutions to this problem. Dr. Taylor Owen, one of the most kind of renowned scholars in this field, talked a lot about how can we do amendments to the Online Harms Act that include AI chatbots. This is one of the choices the government has to make right now. The second would be amendments to the forthcoming Potential Privacy Act, which might be related to AI decision making. But again, going back to Pineau's comments, this is about how do we shift left? This is like a design concept. Can we shift left in the product design process so there is safety by design, so that there is pre-deployment testing, so there is more auditing that is occurring? This could happen in partnership with government bodies like the Canadian AI Safety Institute. I think it's essential that we don't just treat this as a regulatory problem because, number one, Canada's been trying to introduce a whole bunch of different internet regulations all at the same time. Online Streaming Act, Online Harms Act, the AI and Data Act, the Privacy Bill, Potential Privacy Act reform, like trying to do all of these things at once. You want to make sure they're as cohesive and coherent as possible. But if we try and bite off more than we can chew, number one, we might do things wrong. And number two, it seems like digital regulation is a huge issue right now with U.S.-Canada trade. How far do we want to rock the boat? Or are we going to do a whole bunch of legislative work and get ourselves in even more of an issue, have trade issues on the other side and the government comes back? I don't want to ramble, but that's an area of concern. And so what I wonder is how do we also not lose sight of the technical safety solutions that may be more effective at scale in preventing some of these tragedies from occurring in the future?
We've certainly seen some retrenchment from the EU when it comes to AI policy in the face of changes in the global economic, speaking euphemistically like a New York Times headline, in response to the Trump government's trade wars. Michael, on a related note here, you've said that the idea of OpenAI consulting Canadian experts on every issue to be utter nonsense. If we strip away the theater of all that, not you, the theater, your part being theater, but the theater of that process, give us one regulatory or oversight mechanism that you would want to prioritize to protect Canadians from online harms, from AI harms. And I suspect others on the panel will want to fast follow on this one.
Sure. So I'll start. So that comment came or was specifically referenced to some of the responses we've seen from the AI minister in response to his meetings, first with OpenAI executives and then later with Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI. And so I'll start, if you'll permit me, start by saying that I don't think the Online Harms Act, at least as it was introduced as Bill C-63, is the right place to start. I did a post on this and emphasized or focused on the fact that bill is really about dealing with social media companies rather than AI companies. You can say we could still just include them there, but some of the core principles of C-63 of online harms was exactly the things, was not allowing for the things that the government now wants OpenAI to do. So it specifically said we won't engage in online monitoring, or there's simply going to be no proactive monitoring required. There is also going to be no automated reporting to law enforcement. And in fact, when government first consulted on online harms back, I think it's 3-4 years ago, Guilbeault at the time was the heritage minister, they did propose the prospect of proactive monitoring and automated reporting. And those were the issues, two of the issues that attracted the most amount of criticism. The government said, we got to go back to the drawing board. And they made sure not to include it in C-63. So the idea that you can simply take, with all due respect to Taylor, the idea that you can simply take the Online Harms Act and say, oh, we're just going to include these guys too. They're on the internet and they're doing stuff where there's harms, simply doesn't work because they are not the same. And the kind of principles that were essential with respect to social media, you are now saying you want to see them overridden when it comes to AI chatbots. And frankly, I think that's a pretty dangerous approach. But that wasn't your question, sorry, very quickly. You asked, what should we do? And I think the starting point is to say that the AI minister shouldn't require a meeting with corporate executives to know what the policies of OpenAI are and how they're effectively enforced. These systems are not at all transparent, and that opacity is a significant problem. We should know what the policies are, how they're enforced, how often they're enforced, how many times there are requests for information, how many times there is compliance with that information. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to, in each instance, put out a press release saying that local law enforcement came to me and asked about this particular thing, but it does mean, in aggregate, we should know how the system is functioned, how the system functions, and we also should know the details of these kinds of decisions. Because OpenAI has said, listen, We kicked or attempted to kick this person off the system, which of course is a different metric from when you would report to police. So you would have one set of policies to say this person has violated our policies, they're out. That's perfectly reasonable. Then there is a second set of policies, though, that would say that this has become so problematic that we are now going to escalate this to the point that we think we need to report this to law enforcement. That should be a very high threshold. OpenAI said they didn't at that time, based on their policies, meet that threshold. That doesn't strike me as that unreasonable, although of course I don't know what it is that they saw, but we should know publicly what some of these standards are to understand how these decisions are made. And so to me, that's the starting point. But rather than rushing to tell them what to do, we need to tell them, you need to tell us what it is you are doing.
So we're starting with at least something along the lines of a disclosure regime.
There's nothing stopping the government, the RCMP or whoever, from monitoring these systems themselves. And if we're concerned that crimes are taking place, I don't know why we are relying on self-reported. The algorithms that Facebook is built on or that OpenAI is built on are not built for this. They didn't build that security in it. Like I mentioned, neither was Poly built for that. And when you try to alter them, you can actually destroy your business. So to me, and I said this on TVO when we were talking about the mis and disinformation problem, in addition to needing policies, why are we relying? We don't rely on TV networks to police themselves. We have the CRTC to do that. We don't typically rely on advertisers to have good sense in their advertising. We give them guidelines and we have monitoring of advertising, and when they screw up, they get fined or what have you. So we don't rely on advertisers to police themselves or anything. We shouldn't be relying on these companies. We should have, and I think that's what the investment is with Joshua Bengio's company, we're monitoring that, the government, because every country is going to have different policies and things like that. Now, you can require our monitor needs to be on your network. We need to do those things, but we should have our own independent monitoring, I think.
As a purely practical matter, though, I'm wondering, and I'm thinking of this in terms of knowing what the allocations are available for law enforcement just in the cyber realm, how practical is it now with the resources available that we can be expecting law enforcement or government to be monitoring this kind of data?
You could do it very effectively certainly on the mis and disinformation, very effectively. So I would start with that, because that you could do that today. You could do that with our technology today. The finding that needle in a haystack, we have some of that technology that we could do today. You'd need to work on it. The mis and disinformation is easy because it spreads. Okay, the whole point of it is getting amplified. The one guy who does a chat in OpenAI, and again, we don't know what he said, but that's harder. Okay, but definitely the mis and disinformation is something the government, if they really cared about it, could have a solution for that tomorrow.
If I may, I think both Michael and Erin made some really great points. I think I particularly appreciate that Michael placed this onus on, hey, how do you not know? You have to be able to know what's actually going on, especially at the largest AI providers. There has to be this proactive monitoring, transparency. One of the pivot points, though, for me is, again, we can talk about regulation. We can also talk about the entire game has changed here, the speed and scale at which this is happening. And so how do we adjust our instruments? And this idea that they have the AI and we don't, I think also has to change. A government could recruit and actually build AI experts and AI agents in-house that can help with this proactive monitoring and doing it at scale. This idea is not impossible. It can be done through the AI safety institutes. It can be done through collaboration with our AI institutes nationally. And that can actually assist the proactive monitoring so that we're not just always here at the end being like, oh, why didn't we do it fast enough? If AI is working at this speed and we are not also using it to try to do this proactive monitoring, we're not going to be successful.
I get really nervous when we're actively encouraging government and potentially law enforcement to engage in more proactive monitoring. If you look at the notice paper today, lawful access is back and will be reintroduced within the next day or two. The government takes the same approach that they did in the last lawful access bill, more performative consultation to fix that last bill. We will end up with a system whereby law enforcement can demand from AI providers, because it's anyone who provides a service in Canada, access to a whole range of personal information. I'm not a big fan of saying, let's leave it to government and government agencies to proactively monitor as much as possible, and then create systems whereby they are entitled to access much of that personal information without even any sort of court oversight.
So you see the problem for businesses. We're stuck in between. What do we do?
In the early days, and by early post-release of ChatGPT and the panic that ensued, a lot of the discussion was, and I'm remembering Sam Altman testifying to Congress, essentially saying, so I created this thing. It might destroy the world. You should probably do something about that. You should regulate it. I'm not going to stop. Somebody should do something. But yeah, we have seen, and I'm not conflating you in what you're working on with those projects, but it has been, and again, this may have been performative. We had AI companies saying, regulate it or don't regulate it. If you're going to regulate it, do it now before we get too far down the road on this.
Brent, I want to pick up on something you said earlier, which is regarding the EU. I think you mentioned a retrenchment around the AI Act. We are also seeing at the same time the Mario Draghi report calling for a rapid deregulation in Europe. We are also seeing Chancellor Merz from Germany come out and say, we need a regulatory clean slate. There's over 140,000 regulations in Europe. And so I've heard different discourse saying Canada needs to become more like Europe. But what happens if we do that? It seems like the indication is that we lose economic competitiveness, especially in the digital realm. If we lose economic competitiveness, if we lose leverage, again, like the rules may not matter because we are wholly dependent. So I just want to come back to I think that is critically important. If we do not balance our economic competitiveness with some of these rules, like we lose our ability to enforce the rules.
Pause there to ask whether or not we're in the upside down when we are hearing from the German government that there's too much regulation.
We are in a strange timeline, Brent. That is no question. I can affirm that.
Fair enough. While I have you, Jaxson, could you give us 2 or 3 options that are realistically on the table for a federal AI strategy over the next, let's say, 12 to 14 months?
And again, I won't say this is definitely what they're going to do, but kind of choice number one is, do we build and support champions more, or do we do more kind of ecosystem building? Do we reinvest in the pan-Canadian AI strategy, talent strategy? Again, I don't think these are like, this is not a total binary, but there has to be they'll have to make a choice here. To be very blunt, is it 70-30? How much do we invest in champions versus, I think this idea of picking winners or champions in Canada is very uncomfortable. I think we like everyone to win. We usually have a bit of a sprinkler system in terms of how we distribute government funding in a regional capacity. That may not be successful in this modern economy, which does not seem to, or modern trading world, which does not seem to follow rules in the same way, where you have the president of France literally picking up the phone and saying, you need to buy our AI or else. Or the American government and their national security strategy saying we want to export the entire AI stack. We want other nations in our alliance to be dependent on us. It's not an environment to operate like a Boy Scout and to operate and thinking that everything is going to be very fair, because it's not. And so what do we do when our back is up against a wall? We may have to make some hard choices. We may also have to maybe bite the bullet a little bit and actually invest. These are things that the government has to consider. So that's like on the investment side in terms of companies. The second is, again, we talked about infrastructure. It's kind of like how much, quote unquote, how sovereign. I think this is one of the proposals and one of the reports said, as Canadian as possible of a stack. I think that's not a bad measure. Again, we're not going to get to an 100% Canadian stack. This idea that we're going to build our own chips in-house and we're also going to build all the models and it's not going to happen. Doesn't mean we don't have huge potential. TELUS is a company in Toronto. I believe they just raised hundreds of millions of dollars. They've invented some like next level inference chips. So again, the tech that actually powers, not the training part, but when you're actually fielding requests to the systems, which is going to be 90% of the compute. Like we have maybe some innovative capabilities there. We don't want to let those go, but we can't build the entire stack around these kind of new edge capabilities. So that's how I think about infrastructure. The last would just be quickly on the safety and trust pillar. We might see some new regulation. I doubt it's going to be the same type of big horizontal AI and Data Act that we had before. If I had to make a bet, there'll be some targeted pieces of legislation around things that we can all agree on, low-hanging fruit, like sexually explicit deepfakes. Maybe some of these online harms that we're seeing, we'll see in what capacity. But again, also like the technical solutions. Will there be safety reporting? Will there be an empowerment of existing regulators, institutions? Like those are choices the government will have to make. So I'm curious.
On that point, you raised something I just wanted to flag because I don't hear this in the discussion. We talk about the data centers all the time, the energy to support the data centers and so on. You raised the issue of the chips and that being part of a sovereign solution. For those that don't know this, and I commend to you, and I can't remember the author's name top of my head, there's a book called Chip Wars, which talks about essentially the history of compute power and microprocessors up to more or less the present and the situation we're in now, where the kinds of chips you need to power this are mostly made in one factory in Taiwan with help from one factory in Europe that has the lithography technology, and essentially no one else on the planet knows how to do this or has the ability to pick up and start doing it today.
But even that's going to change. We're moving away from those kinds of chips because, as you can see, they're power hogs. So we're moving away from that. And Canada has a great opportunity to be at the next forefront. Instead of trying to catch up to the Americans, what's 5 years from now? And it's not silicon-based chips. I'm going to put that out to you. I'm not going to tell you what it is. You got to go research it.
I wish you'd raised this in the pre-call. Now I have to go call my investment broker,
Yeah. So,
dumping my NVIDIA stock.
yeah, I think NVIDIA was at the forefront of this, and somebody else is going to be at the forefront of the next type of computer processor. We've always been good at the plumbing. We rolled out internet faster than anyone else. We are plumbers. We are telecom. But the money is in the chips and in the apps. Okay, so we have to make a decision too. Are we just going to be infrastructure players? Because that's what we keep hearing. Maybe. We certainly know how to do that. We're good at it. It's what we've always done. But I think there's an opportunity to get at the money layer. And so we have to get up that lever. And we desperately need to change our tax system to allow more Canadians to participate and invest in that future. There's very little incentive for Canadians to invest in companies today.
Can you say a little more about that? Before you do, though, to the person who said ow or wow in the audience, if you're from NVIDIA, I'm just kidding, big fan. Talk to you later.
What was I going to talk about?
The tax structure.
Oh, yes, the taxation. Yeah. So when I was doing my last financing round, it was literally the day out. I was in the middle of my last raise when the government brought up the capital gains tax because we had to pay for COVID. And I can tell you that was just a freeze over Canadian investment. And so we went to the US. Okay. And the US was more than happy. Americans were like, great. And all of my investors in that round were American. And they said, we love Canada. You guys have a great education system. You've got all the educated people, because we send more of our kids to university than they do per capita. And you've got SR&ED and everything that takes you up to a certain level. And then you've got no funding. So we're able to see who the great companies are. And then you stop funding them. So you come to America, and now they move to America. And we take it to here, and that's exactly where you need to take it to for the Americans to go shopping. We don't take it to Series A, Series B.
I'm just going to jump back in super quick. One of the other things in the reports is proposals, should we increase capital gains exemptions for entrepreneurs to 15, 20 million? The other is, should we get the pension plans to put 5% of their investments into these types of investments? This would potentially solve some of the capital problems that Canadian entrepreneurs face. But I'd say if we're moving towards more Canadian ownership, we have to face the reality that again, this is not great companies like founded by Erin that move to the US because of the capital. It's actually companies that stay in Canada still end up often 75% on average owned by American investment firms. And so again, even if we build the tech here, we don't always own it when it actually comes to. So it's another thing the government may have to figure out.
And we're still Canadian owned, by the way. We didn't sell the farm, but the next round, I would like to have more Canadians. I just don't know if they'll be there.
Yeah, this is the quandary for everything from startups and biotech to high tech to, Canadian rock bands, frankly. They end up in the States at some point or another. Erin, you're already on a roll on this, so let me come back to you on this. What's one step, and I don't know if maybe you've already addressed this maybe with the tax question, but you're a company that's struggling to deal with what's available here in Canada to succeed here in Canada. What's one step that a government could take in the next year to change that reality for you? And I'd love to hear also if the other panelists have thoughts on this, not about your company specifically, but about changing the calculus for companies in this space.
I've already said the tax thing, so I'll pick something else.
You can ask for a pony now. Whatever you like.
Here's one. Here's what I think is interesting. We're integrating into Microsoft Copilot. Okay. Long story there. I'm not going to go into the whole thing. But I was at an event, and the Ontario government said, we are the biggest purchasers of Copilot in North America. Isn't that great? They've got 50,000 licenses. Have they put Ask Polly on their Copilot thing? No, I'm sure they haven't, because they don't know that it's there. They don't know we're Canadian. So I think even now, when I do work with the federal government, but I've got to talk to each person individually. We're not on a list of Canadian AI companies. There is no way to present to government and say, here's what we do, because a lot of them are buying meltwater. They're not even as good as Polly, to be honest with you, but they're not Canadian either. And what counts as Canadian is that meltwater has an office in Toronto, so it's Canadian. We're actually Canadian IP paid for by SR&ED, paid for by Canadian taxpayers. So it should be in a catalog somewhere that people know that this is a Canadian technology.
So there's a procurement issue here too,
Yes.
and the massive incumbent advantage if your AI is bolted onto an Office suite that most of the country uses, whether it's Microsoft or Google.
Yeah, if they're the biggest purchasers of Copilot, then they should buy we are the only Canadian app on Copilot, by the way, right now. Hey, yes, worldwide, because we were an early adopter. And it's hard to integrate your foreign technologies. So yeah, we're the only Canadian app that you can buy. So they should get it.
I'd just be happy if Copilot would properly form my PowerPoint, but we'll come back to that.
Yeah, exactly.
Other thoughts here on what we could be doing in the short term?
I just want to highlight a challenge because I think we've had a lot of really interesting, innovative ideas of the things we could do. And I do wonder if within government, from a leadership perspective, we are structured to be able to even do this. So some of the suggestions around tax policy, Evan Solomon's not going to be the minister that gets to decide on tax policy. So that's a finance issue. We haven't talked about copyright related issues, for example, within large language models, both the inputs and the outputs. Well, that's a shared responsibility between Heritage and ISED. Evan Solomon's not the one that gets to decide that either. We've talked about the need for privacy. Privacy is nominally an issue that is decided also by ISED. There are at least leadership on that file. So does Solomon get to decide that? We talk about the harms related issues that started at Heritage and then moved to Justice. And I recognize there was no AI minister at the time, but while I see the real value in having someone who takes ownership of the issue and leads, the ability to move beyond, honestly, photo ops with large checks into actual policy is really difficult, both because it requires making hard decisions, and at times these are hard decisions when there isn't a consensus either around the issue or around what ought to be prioritized, but it's also a challenge when you don't have line responsibility on that particular policy. What I'm basically saying is that AI policy really is a whole of government issue, and we don't do whole of government issues very well when it comes to these kinds of policies.
I'm going to come to you, Jaxson, in a second, but just a fast follow from me on that. I did speak with, when I'm going to call it AIDA because I like opera, when the federal AI law was going through the development process, one thing that struck me in talking to the folks that had ownership of it was there didn't seem to be much consultation even within government. So it does, I think you're absolutely right. This is an area where the traditional silos we have around legislation and responsibility for legislation don't seem to work. Jaxson, go ahead.
Michael hit the nail right on the head. I think at this paper we published at U of T, we identified at minimum there's 6 different agencies, key federal actors that are trying to deal with digital policy. You've got Heritage, you've got Justice, you've got ISED, you've got Treasury Board Secretariat, Shared Services Canada, PSBC, in the procurement conversations, probably a whole bunch of other folks that we'll have to figure out. But what I think about is
Ministry of Transport, autonomous vehicles.
Exactly, right? So there are all these disaggregated responsibilities. Should every ministry effectively have a digital capacity internally? Probably. Everybody's going to have to interact. This is like saying some ministries are going to have the internet and some others. That's just not realistic. But from a policy perspective, coherent policy, what have other countries done that have been perhaps more successful? I think a ministry of digital, perhaps digital and AI, that actually has teeth, that actually has machinery under it. Because keep in mind, with the new minister of AI right now, doesn't have a lot of machinery under him. He's still housed within ISED. And so what could it look like to try and consolidate some of this? I will just say, from having sometimes private, personal conversations with former public servants, current senior ones, this is a bit of a mess, and it doesn't have to be this way. So I think about the UK, where they have consolidated their Ministry of Digital and AI into DSIT. I think that could be a model where we could at least learn something. The second thing would be AI specifically. We're talking a lot about sovereign AI. Again, how do we actually bring that back to investments? The UK has a sovereign AI unit with 500 million pounds behind it to build and buy and test. Like, having that concentrated expertise for both policy and investment making, I think, could be quite valuable for the country. Right now, we don't have it.
So we're moving on to the lightning round here, and I think I'm going to ask each of you. There's no prize at the lightning round, by the way, so don't get too excited. But I'm going to ask each of you to, and we may have already done this, but we're going to give you a last chance to address this. One concrete action you'd like to see the government take in the next year. One thing you'd like the government to stop doing if we're going to have a viable strategy here.
Oh, gosh. I'm going to say this on all of our behalf, but I think Michael and I have talked about this the most over the years, but get the privacy bill done. This is just common sense. It's holding everything back. We have, the privacy bill existed before iPhones, existed before social networks. The last time Pipit, I think, was introduced in 2002. This is bad from a harms perspective. It's harming Canadian society on an active basis. The second thing is, it's holding us back from an innovation perspective. Why is it so hard for our health systems to finally coordinate and work together? It's because we don't have provisions to make that easily these socially beneficial applications. The pandemic was made that much harder by not having this data sharing capacity. It also hurt things like open banking, modern finance. And so getting the privacy bill done. The last time I was in industry committee, we actually had good good agreement amongst a lot of the MPs, different parties to get this thing done. So I hope they put it out, and I hope it's soon, and I hope it gets done in this session.
There were a lot of nods in the room when you first raised that, so I think you're right.
Yeah, and I would agree with that because it's good for business too to just have certainty, to not be wondering all the time what's happening. But I would say my number one thing is we need a way to encourage capital investment in Canada in our own companies. We're a very conservative culture. The entrepreneurs aren't conservative, but the Canadians are conservative, and they need an incentive to not just be investing in real estate all the time, because that's what we do here. So I think that would be the number one thing. If we want to be an innovation economy, we have to invest in it.
Okay. I obviously agree with the privacy piece, but that gives the opportunity to focus on something else. So I'll say we need an AITA, AI Transparency Act, which addresses not just the issues I was talking about earlier in terms of obligations to both to report and policy, but transparency goes further than that. For example, we ought to be able to know what is included in large language models and have that included by way of regulation. Because another one of the issues that frankly is going to prove very difficult to solve is some of the copyright related questions as to which rights and at what point rights, and can you continue to scrape, much like search engines have scraped. These are all really challenging issues. We've seen it play out a little bit in the UK right now, and they are struggling to land on something there. I suspect we will as well. But at a minimum, it does seem to me that people whose works are being used, creators and others, ought to have the right to know that their work is being used, and then the right to say, I don't want my work to be used. That means both that you have the granular ability to say, I am comfortable with search accessing my content, but not comfortable with having it used for large language model purposes. And you also have to have the ability to know all of this. And the knowing in a Transparency Act might well create an obligation to create some sort of searchable database so people know what is being included and incorporated.
Yeah, and I'd go even further than that. All the training data, yes, the training data. Also, when people say AI is biased or it's racist or it's just, no, AI is not those things. The training material was, right? And people will say, oh, this is a black box, it's my IP. It's not. Your algorithm is the IP. The training material is not. That should always be transparent. Even the algorithm can be. If you've got it patented, you've got to publish it anyway. So when people say it's a black box because they actually don't have any IP, that's what I would conclude. You're just taking somebody else's, you're putting something on top of ChatGPT and calling it AI. It's not really original, because if it's original, you would have an algorithm, you'd have it patented, and it would be published.
I like that take. Yeah, anecdotally, I heard an interesting podcast. Some people will probably remember there was an alarming report a few months back that an AI model, I think it may have been Claude, when pressed to make some difficult decisions and do something, basically decide something that was going to be unethical, and then the notion was they were going to shut the chatbot down. It tried to blackmail the founder of the company. It turns out to be the case that was a scenario that the algorithm was put in deliberately, and it was essentially acting out a role that suited the role that the training data, which was essentially every human story ever written, it was training it to act inside. So yeah, we get into trouble when we anthropomorphize the technology. Jaxson, you look like you had a thought.
I was going to say one last example. It's also, can you even test these things appropriately? So Claude also recently was put through a test. It went onto the internet, found some, I believe, encrypted information, decrypted it, and found the answer key to that test, and then fulfilled it immediately. So these emergent capabilities, it's wild. Yeah.
The agentic browsers are keeping me up at night, yes. I'm going to ask one more question, and I anticipate I'm going to walk out on you while you're giving the answer. Don't take that personally. I just have to go. But this has been a fascinating discussion. Before I move on to that, and then we'll move on to the Q&A, and I'll leave you to the tender mercies of our audience here. I just want to put this out there to everyone who's listening online and everyone who's here today. If you're inspired or concerned by any of these things, I want to mention the Internet Society is in the process of an ongoing, and this is now going to be something we do all around, or all the time, working on white papers addressing the issues we're talking about today and just about everything else in the digital economy. We have policy roundtables where we formulate those policies. If you are interested, if you have thoughts that you want to contribute, please reach out to us. I'm even going to invite you to email me personally if you want to. I'm very online. Use your discretion in what you send me. That's all I'll say. I do work at a law firm. So the last question I want to ask our panel before I disappear on you is, let's project forward to 2030 and assume that we're all still alive, what's the first indicator, looking back to now, that'll tell you that Canada's AI strategy, whatever that it may end up having been, will have succeeded? Take your time.
2030? That's not very far.
You tell me, where do you think we'll be at a point to look back and know? Because that's an excellent point.
It's hard to say. We need to see the strategy. How will we know it's been successful? I guess when we stop fearing, and I don't think this is going to be 2030, we stop fearing that if the President of the United States wakes up one morning and decides LLMs are just too important to national security, so we're not going to share them with Canada, because there's a lot of businesses in Canada that have built businesses on top of those American technologies. Even if he decides that anything to do with AI, like he's going to pull it out. All our AIs, we can't survive without the American technology right now. That's the reality. So that's how you'll know, but that we've achieved, that we're sovereign.
I had hoped that this would open up the possibility for ending on a positive note, but maybe it's not that kind of topic. You make an excellent point. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, so I'm going to avoid answering the question by focusing on the timeline. So I think back to when I got started in academia in the late 1990s, and might have well done a similar kind of panel where there were concerns about the internet that was just emerging, and someone might have said, TELUS in 2003. What success is part of David Johnson's IHAC report, which was the Information Highway Advisory Council, the report that how Canada was going to be a lead in the internet. And we might have identified certain things that this would look good by 2003. But I think the real lesson, looking back now, more than 20 years after that, is that the change can be very slow in certain respects in the beginning and then very fast, but it feels like, wow, it's moving so quickly, but you need a bit more time for this. And so part of the problem is our political timelines are typically way shorter than the timelines to actually see some of this through, which creates problems with respect to incentives, because the government will say, judge us in the next election. Let's assume it's an election several years down the road based on what we've accomplished. But the problem is good policy will often take far longer to actually be fully implemented and realized than that sort of timeline. And so how do you ensure that we aren't asking the question, what does success look like in 2030, but have the ability to say, we're more interested in what this looks like in, say, 2040 or 2050, which is a more realistic timeline to fully see the transformative effects that I think are likely to take place.
So a generational project in a country that has 4-year election cycles. Interesting challenge. Go ahead, Jaxson.
I think there's 3 indicators which are relatively measurable. First is talent retention that actually builds in Canada. So I think almost all the top engineers at Waterloo, I think it's 66%, go to Silicon Valley. And not just that it's about the top computer science engineers, but I think that is a good indicator to measure. Do we attract and retain, or are we just subsidizing talent to go and build companies in the US? And so how do we create incentives? I even floated some crazy idea like, why are we not paying these people to come back or at least stay to build in Canada? Because the economic returns would be like 1,000x. Second would be, have we actually built some meaningful AI companies in Canada, or we just have Shopify as a large tech company? Do we actually believe in our champions? Do we actually have them? Do they invest? Do they want to stay here? Do we create the conditions for that to happen? That's a measurable thing. And the third one is trust. It seems like Canadians are actually some of the most mistrustful of AI in the world. Maybe it's because we're nice people, we're rule followers. It seems, I read that recent chart where it said in the US, the question was, do you think your fellow citizens are morally good? The US was at the bottom, Canada's at the top. Number one, that's awesome for our country that we think so highly of each other, but it seems like we are more trusting of human intelligence than artificial intelligence. So how can we figure out how to build more of that trust? And that will directly lead to adoption right now. I think we're at 12% adoption across our industry. If we don't figure out that trust gap, we're not going to see the adoption, and our economic competitiveness is going to keep going down. It looks like Brent has left us, so it looks like I'm in charge now, but...
So now if you have a question, we've got a mic in the aisle there. Please feel free to come up and ask your question.
All right.
Hello, thank you. My name is Peter McKinnon, and thank you very much for this very interesting panel discussion. I'm just wondering, in the balance between innovation and regulation, or some kind of controls on AI, if there's a possibility of developing what I would call nimble policy. In other words, there's some flexibility in the policy as it evolves. Is this a possibility? Because when we think of law, it gets cast in stone, so to speak, and stands for X years. But I think with AI and the rate of change of the technology, that we need a more nimble policy orientation. Any views on that? Thank you.
Sure. I can start by saying, I think in some ways that's the holy grail. I think on many of these issues, there's been a real desire to find ways to be able to adapt more readily to change. I don't think that we've done a particularly good job of it. The mechanisms that we've seen include mandatory reviews. So legislation passes, we say we're going to review it every 3 years, every 5 years. We have that in the privacy bill that we were talking about. It needs updating. So that highlights just how well that's going. It hasn't proven to work particularly well. In other instances, we've seen efforts to say that we will use the legislation to load in some core principles, but we will punt the issues either to regulation or to a regulator. We see that especially in the digital space, let's say with C11 and C18, we'll leave it to the CRTC. And so if you look at Bill C11, which is currently in the courts and still awaiting CRTC decisions and the subject of US trade pressure, I'd say it's not working all that well either. So I think you're right. In an ideal world, there would be the ability to iterate and respond far more effectively and a willingness to acknowledge that sometimes we don't always get it right and to course correct. But so far in the digital space, the only times we see any potential course correction is if there is enough of a hue and cry about something before it actually passes that the government rethinks a little bit. Lawful access might be a bit of an example, or we get an election call and the bill dies altogether.
If I may to your question as well, smart regulation is eminently possible. History indicates that we've had it before. I think of this most principally in the context of pro-competition regulation. Think about the FTC when it actually played an active role and was constantly encouraging more competition, more innovation. That is a good thing. I think in Canada, sometimes we comfort ourselves with a lot of red tape, a bit of a walled garden that keeps things comfortable but isn't always innovative. And so how do we get to that point? Canadians also are telling us what they want. So the Pan-Canadian AI strategy had a working group that talked about public awareness, and 71% of those respondents said that they wanted some sort of appropriate risk regulation to AI in order to trust it more. So if we can figure out that trust gap, again, with smart, good, appropriate regulation, we can drive more adoption. So these things go together.
Thank you very much. I just might mention one more thing. It's just for historical purposes here. We've been talking about data sovereignty. It's a new topic in the last year or two. But in fact, transborder data flow has been a topic at the OECD since the early 1990s. And there's a lot of literature on looking at transborder data flow activities back in those days that may have relevance to looking at developing sovereignty policy for data today. Thank you.
Yeah, one last quick comment on data sovereignty. I think 25% of Canadian data, even if it's meant to stay within Canada, still passes through a U.S. transit point. So worth keeping in mind. The second thing, this is a little bit more literally in space, but I think there was a recent Wired study that said 50% of satellite traffic is available unencrypted. And Prime Minister Carney was recently talking about Telesat, the new kind of sovereign satellite network. I think also thinking about how do we preserve more of that data in Canada in a secure way.
Yes. Hello, my name is Murray McKercher. I'm involved with ICANN as a multi-stakeholder organization. And my question to you is, should we form a multi-stakeholder organization around AI to act somewhat like ICANN in overseeing the internet?
I believe we should be doing that. I think it, like I mentioned, ad standards is it's funded by industry to help them to implement the government's regulations on ads. I think it's needed, and I think it has to be a third party. I don't think you can, for technical reasons as well as just other reasons, I don't think you can rely on the platforms that are not Canadian. I know they operate in Canada, but I don't think you can rely on them. And we've not had great history trying to regulate them so far, and it's causing all sorts of friction. I think having a third party, I think that's the way to go. I personally do.
Yeah, so I spent quite a lot of years dealing with internet governance related issues, and I don't think it was the intent of the analogy, but in some ways, my concern would be that this would become like an ICANN, where you have the illusion of multi-stakeholder and the ability to actually make decisions, but at the end of the day, it's the U.S. government that stands behind and actually controls.
I also think it's important to think about who do you include and exclude. So think about middle powers. The leader of the opposition has been talking quite a bit about Canada, UK, New Zealand, Australia. I also think about countries with shared history, democratic values, partnership, Japan, South Korea. How do we actually get more of those middle powers working together so that we can operate on a more level playing field, a shared set of standards? We actually wield a lot of economic power together if we were to partner some of those countries with European countries, friendly East Asian countries, for example. Otherwise, if you were in a US-led or China-led association or multi-stakeholder alliance, they may skew that towards their own aims and goals. So something to think about.
I love that idea. I love that idea. All
right, now we'll do it together.
Yeah, okay. Let's talk after.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lucy Kai. I just wanted to thank you for your time and for the panel so far. Jaxson, I really wanted to touch on your point about the trust aspect of AI adoption. And I guess this is an open question for all of the panelists, but I think most of the public's interaction with AI has been through LLMs. And there's a certain feeling that LLMs are a threat to people's humanity because it's taking over, for example, the creative arts, the creative industries, writing, art, visual arts, music. And there's also a certain fear, I think, that AI is going to take away people's jobs. So I guess this is more of a philosophical question. How do we address those fears? How do we address this feeling that AI is a threat to the feeling of humanity, basically?
Yeah, I'll answer quickly, but I think Michael actually tapped in on this really well earlier. Do we even know what the policies and the design principles of these companies that are providing the LLMs in the first place? I think that's critically important. It tells us because there are baked in values, baked in assumptions there. So it's very important that we know more about those. So I think about it from a design perspective. The second thing I think about is, do we have a good feedback loop? And I'm on the board of a small nonprofit called the Human Feedback Foundation, quite literally. So again, unfortunately, another self-plug, but again, it's a not-for-profit, but they are very focused on open source engagement, human engagement with these models. How do you actually have this interactive conversation, saying, what are those assumptions? What's coming back out? And how do we make sure that it is as human-centric, human-positive as possible? I don't mean to throw out some platitudes, but I do think this matters. And so I don't have a perfect answer to your question, but I do think, again, transparency around what values are baked in, and then can we have a feedback cycle around those so we continue to iterate over time and make sure these systems are as beneficial to humanity as possible.
I don't think we'll be, as Canadians, in charge of that. I think this is just going, and if we're not in AI, if we're not making the movies and writing the stories, the Americans will do it with their AI. So it's not something that I think that we can control. I do take heart in the fact that AI written stories are terrible, but I know that's today. So I think it's just that train has left the station and we have to adapt. I think that's...
Yeah, I do think transparency plays a really key role here. To me, the truth is we use AI for lots of different things and we're perfectly comfortable with it. When I go home after this, AI is going to play a role in telling me which is the best way to go. And I'm not going to think about that. And it's going to play a role throughout my day with any number of different services. There are elements, though, that can creep us out. You call into an organization and you feel somewhat uncomfortable saying, am I talking to a real person or I'm talking to an AI? And I'm never really sure. And you don't want to insult the other person saying you sound like an AI, but I'm feeling a little freaked right now. And the responses at times that you get through the chatbots leaves people a bit uncomfortable, especially as when you have accounts and it begins to remember a lot of the information, it's hearkening back to my vacation last month and stuff like that. And I'm somewhat uncomfortable with that. And so part of this stems from the fact that we don't know. There's too much that we don't know about what is happening here. And I'm not saying that sort of transparency will solve everything. For a lot of people, the notion that they've got to dig in and figure all this stuff out is going to be a problem. It isn't something they're going to do. But I think transparency will go a long way for many of the most skeptical, for certain, to be able to know more. And it may generally shift the tenor of what's taking place as we begin to feel a bit more in control, because we know a bit more about what's actually happening.
Thank you.
Hi, I wanted to pick up on some of the discussion around picking Canadian champions and what that would look like. Jaxson, you mentioned we're nervous about picking winners, but what sort of criteria would you apply? Or what, are we thinking of big companies that have a lot of infrastructure assets that need to be protected? Are we talking about championing new technologies that might come about in 5 years? What do you think would be the best approach or criteria for picking Canadian champions?
Yeah, nice to see you again. I don't know if I'm morally obligated to say TELUS as a Canadian champion given the sponsorship, but no, listen, like we have great companies in Canada. The question is, do we want to invest in them more? Do we want to create policies that benefit them? Because that's what other countries are doing. They are like much more proactively through procurement, through strategic investment, through taxation, whatever it is, they are competing for these companies to be leaders at home and then leaders abroad. So if we don't do that, we may just have more branch plants and more less control. And I don't fully subscribe to the idea, like we have lots of amazing American companies and Swedish companies and companies from all around the world. We want to be a great place for people to do business no matter what, but do we also want to be in the mix? Do we also want to have our own players? Like that is a critical question. It's a values question. So you talk about criteria. I'm not going to be able to give that to you in a good structural detail right now, but I do think about you have to have a balance between what gives us jobs today and what gives us jobs tomorrow. And I also think there's a political orientation around jobs as the focus. We think about our strategic investment fund, the SIF, over the last number of years. Often those were going to job generating investment versus actual strategic investments that would yield long-term royalties and benefits for Canada, including through intellectual property, including through innovative technologies. And so if I had to skew the balance, I would skew more towards that side. Like, how do we develop and own tech that is valuable here? Because look at the value of the US economy. In the last, I think, couple quarters, it was 92% powered by artificial intelligence. That might be bad for some of the other fundamentals of the U.S. economy, but it doesn't, like, there is a lot of growth there. And so much of the value is coming from these trillion-dollar technology companies. And so we may not be able to get to a trillion-dollar technology company in Canada. I don't want to say it's impossible, but can we have more $10 billion companies? Can we have more $100 billion companies? And a lot of those will be technologically driven. And so I would orient the criteria towards those types of companies because that's where we're going on. AI, quantum, robotics, advanced manufacturing, biotech, this is where the future is.
I have to respectfully say that I have no particular expertise here, but wow, I think this notion, there's a difference between picking winners or what we think will be winners and trying to support some of the existing winners. When we've got existing lead players, finding ways to enhance their profile globally or trying to support them domestically makes sense. The picking winner structure, whether it was the super clusters where it just happens that the 5 super clusters represented 5 different regions in the country, is a joke. We don't do this well for political reasons. We spent huge amounts of money in the electric automotive area with battery stuff. A lot of that stuff now isn't going to pay off. I don't know that government is particularly good at picking winners.
They're not.
And so, no, thank you. They're not. And no, I would say that we don't pick winners. I would say that we do far more, though, to say that we want to champion our champions. And there, I think government can play a pretty significant role.
Yeah, look up Element AI. Does anybody remember Element AI?
Oh, yeah.
550 employees, never got a paying customer, ever. Funded by government, funded by VCs that were connected with the government. Okay, they sucked all the talent out of the country. They were all in Montreal. 550 employees, never made a product, never sold anything, and then it just disappeared without anybody like talking about it. But that was picking a winner, and it didn't win. And by the way, the founder of that, we just gave $100 million to start another company. Okay, Globe and Mail didn't report on that part of it.
So the question is, do we pick winners or do we run the race? And is there a race even to be run? So look what the US is doing, the quantum benchmarking initiative. They're trying to pull all the top quantum companies, both in the US and abroad, to the United States. They're running a race with massive incentives so that technology gets built there, so it gets exported globally. Maybe they're not putting the hand on the scale saying it has to be this company X and Y and Z, but they're saying that this is a priority. They're putting money behind it, and hopefully it's run as fairly as possible with lots of expertise. Otherwise, we could also see lots of our quantum companies, let's say, go down there and we miss the next boat. That is a real reality that we have to face. And the question is, how can government get involved in a way that is ideally not putting their hand on the scale? That is a question we have to figure out, and we'll see if the AI strategy is indicative of success there.
Thank you so much to TELUS again for sponsoring today's event. Thank you, Michael, Erin, Jaxson, and Brent. You'll see it online since he's not here. And thank you all for coming out on a day where we weren't sure what was going to happen with the weather. I did just want to quickly, so thanks again to everyone. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.